When you hear the phrase snow monster, I bet a lizard isn't the first thing that comes to your mind. Well, luckily, this is a salamander, and salamanders aren't lizards. And technically it's a frost salamander, which I think qualifies it as a snow monster. The reason that's important is because last month my patrons voted on an art challenge theme of snow monsters. I was originally going to build a wampa, or a yeti. When I saw this bad boy at the hobby store, decided this was the monster for me. The giant ancient ancestor of Randall from Monsters, Inc. was one of the many monsters that 15th century knights spent their time slaying and being slain by. I had a leftover box of knights from a previous build that I've been looking for an excuse to use, and this project seemed like the right one. I love how customizable these knights from Perry Miniatures are. They come with a great variety of weapons and armor loadouts and poses for their horses. One of these knights picked a sword, another came with a lance, and the third guy, he's the dingus of the group, he came with a hammer, which is actually a violation of the first rule of knighthood. Never bring a hammer to a giant salamander fight. The other two knights also got ornate feathers to go on top of their helmets, and the reason the third guy didn't get one is because it's going to be scorched off by the icy hot breath from the salamander. I wanted the monster to have a better reason for the angry expression on his face, so I made it look like he had been through a couple rodeos before this. In addition to the lance pieces, I also added some weapons and armor on the base beneath the salamander. Once the figures were figured out, it was time to move on to the base. I grabbed a sheet of MDF, I cut it down to my desired size off camera on my bandsaw, and then I cut 4 strips of wood to complete the box that would make up the base. I glued them all together with CA glue. To build up the terrain that these little knuckleheads will be fighting on, I cut a piece of XPS insulation foam to match the dimensions of the base, and then I shaped it with my handheld hot wire. The goal was to make a nice little hill that each of these knights was willing to die on. Once I was happy with the shape, I glued it to the wooden base with some foam-safe superglue. Before moving on, I made sure to add a little hole for a power switch so I didn't have to do that later when there was more stuff on the top. The next step was to cover the foam with the terrain paste, so I got out a crusty mixing cup that I've used before, grabbed some Sculptamold, I mixed it with water till it was nice and spreadable. Once thoroughly mixed, I slapped it on there. Because I kept the salamander on its original base, I decided to embed it in the terrain paste so I could more easily blend it together with the rest of the base. I also added an unfortunate 4th member of the Knight Squad, as well as his fallen steed. I then set aside the base to dry and I moved back over to the minis. I started with a dark gray primer from a rattle can, and then I threw on a zenithal highlight using the airbrush. For the coloration of the horses, I drew my inspiration from root beer, chocolate, and butterscotch. The knights decided that's what they wanted to name their horses, but since none of those things had reached Europe by the 1400s, the names had no meaning to the knights, and ironically, the lightest horse ended up with the name chocolate, while the darkest horse ended up with the name butterscotch. I painted all the armor on the knights with some steel, and then I applied a dark wash over top to add some depth to the recesses, and I finished up all the painting with a dry brushing to help those edges pop, and that was the knights done. For the monster and the base, I primed and applied a zenithal highlight outside with the spray cans, and once that was dry, I began painting with the airbrush. I wanted to make the salamander a bit more frosty than the colors shown on the back of the box, so I applied a royal blue underbelly followed by a gray blue around the middle with some almost white blue on the top. After that, I painted on the eyes and a few other details, including the nails and teeth and some edge highlights with a brush. I gave a blue wash and a red wash to the teeth and nails of the monster as well, and then I painted the sleeping horse and the 4th member of the Knight Squad under Randall's foot. And in case you're wondering what the name of this horse is, the Knights decided on vanilla ice cream. They have absolutely no concept of vanilla ice cream, but I told them that it would go really well with the other names, and they liked the sound of it. After that, I applied a colorful array of washes to the rocks. Once that was dry, I followed it up with a dry brush of gray, followed by a dry brush of white. I gave these rocks just a little bit extra with the dry brushing to help them look a little more frosty. After that, it was time to throw the knights on the base, but I had to clip them off of their little bases before I could add them to the big base. I drilled some holes in the feet of the horses as well as on the base, and anchored in some little metal rods to keep the knights nice and secure after they were in place. Next, it was time to work out the lights. I decided to use one white and one blue filament to give it a nice frosty fire look. I drilled a hole in the back of the monster's mouth to be an anchor point for the filaments, and I installed a switch and battery housing underneath the base. I tested my circuit to make sure everything was working properly before moving on. I then drilled two holes, one for the positive lead and one for the negative lead that would run up through the base and provide power to the filament. I connected one end of the filament to the wire that came up through the monster's mouth, and then I wrapped the filament around the knight, and I connected the other end of the filament down to a wire that was connected at the base next to the horse's leg. After that was the cotton. Well, technically this is polyfill, but this will help defuse the light and give it a more flame-like or icy hot, glowing vape cloud appearance. To add a little more realism to this blue fiery cloud, I painted all of the furthest sections of cloud black with the airbrush. I wanted to add a little bit more snow to the base, so I whipped up a batch of snow paste from these snowflakes and Mod Podge, and I smeared it all over the base. Once the snow paste had some time to set a little, I added some snowy footprints as well. The last thing to do was to paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0. After that, I called it good. Before moving on to my final shots, please take a moment to appreciate the beautiful artwork submitted by my patrons for the December Snow Monster Art Challenge. Thanks again to all of the patrons who participated in last month's art challenge. Consider this the second installment in a new medieval fantasy series. Many of you have asked for more fantasy content, and I have wanted to do more fantasy content, and this seemed like the right way to do it. I will be doing something similar to the Wild Imaginary West, with these big monster encounters on these standalone dioramas. They will be completely separate though. The Wild Imaginary West is its own universe. This is not a history for the Wild Imaginary West, but it will be similar in a lot of ways. I'm excited about this new project, and I hope that you'll come along and enjoy it as well. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out, as always, to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.